Good morning and welcome to our ongoing study of the ministry of the Spirit, otherwise the book of Acts as written by Luke. We're going to be today looking at Paul going to Athens. It's in the 17th chapter. Plan to spend 2 weeks with Paul in Athens because it is very interesting, very unusual, and very important. So I'm going to do something somewhat unusual this morning. I would like to spend a little time giving you the background, giving you an idea of what Paul was stepping into when he went to Athens, when he went to the Agora. And next week we'll look at his appearance before the Council of the Areopagus. This information you may be familiar with, but I think that it helps us to understand the situation, which is most unusual. It's really a very thrilling situation. So let's begin. This is Acts 17. It's actually the second of three portions in which we'll talk about Acts 17. So I'm calling this Paul in Athens, Part 1, the Agora, the marketplace. And notice the writing underneath the title, the subscription, if you please, Jerusalem meets Athens. Jerusalem, the center of Christianity, Jerusalem, the capital of Judaism, the city of David, the holy city, the place from which emanated the teaching of monotheism, of the one God. Athens, the cultural capital of the world, very different. Jerusalem meets Athens. It's Acts 17, verse 16 to 21 for today. So let's look at the text. Please note it carefully, and then we'll come to some background information, come back to the text. Acts 17, verse 16. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. Now, it's easy for us to overlook verse 17, this part of verse 17, and it's very important. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons. We want to focus, of course, on his interacting with people in the Agora and in the Council of the Areopagus, but he went first to the synagogue. That's his pattern. We've seen why. He always goes to the synagogue. He is expected to do that. He is supposed to do that, and it's a wonderful opportunity to convert people who are there, who believe in God, who know the scriptures, and who can be excellent witnesses for Christ. So he goes to the synagogue, and he reasons in the synagogue. It's interesting that word is used. He's reasoning with Jews and devout persons. We have seen before, devout persons refers to proselytes of the gate who are there, that is, Gentiles who are there, who are pursuing Judaism. As Calvin said, devout means people who were done with idols. And these are people who had become disenchanted with the traditional pantheon of gods of the Greeks and Romans. And that was the case at this particular time. And it was an ideal time for the gospel to come. Now, Luke does not give us the results there. He's focusing, of course, on the incidents in the Agora and in the Areopagus, but it is likely that Paul indeed converted some based on the fact that he usually does when he goes into a synagogue. Now, the marketplace, the Agora, we've already seen that all Greco-Roman cities had a marketplace. And of course, the one in Athens is the most important of all, probably. It was the headquarters of the Athenian government. And there in the Agora were many idols, altars to pagan gods, even temples. One of those temples still stands, the Temple of Hephaestus. It stands because it was used in the Middle Ages as a Christian church. And he encountered all kinds of people there, but also he encountered philosophers. Now, here's a picture on the left of the Agora as it appears today, somewhat grown up. I doubt it was that grown up in Paul's day. And the buildings would have been intact. Now, as you wander through it, as I have done, you're going to see fallen buildings, columns, pieces of columns, buildings, and parts of the altars and markers as where a temple or an altar stood, all over the Agora. And to the right, you're going to see pictures of the founders of the two schools of philosophy, with whose disciples Paul will be interacting. And we'll look at that particularly in our study next week. Now, Athens is just not any city. All the places Paul went are significant. We've talked about that with Antioch and Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea. Athens was the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Now, it has a long and distinguished history. Athens has given us philosophy, has given us history, has given us epic poetry. Athens has given us democracy. And there was this long development in the direction of democracy that resulted in the world's first true democracy, and some would say the only true democracy. It reached its height in the 5th century BC under a general who had assumed leadership of Athens at that time, named Pericles, the age of Pericles. Athens, however, provoked a war with their rival city, Sparta, the other big city in Greece, and lost that war in the 4th century. It was a long war. And subsequently, even Sparta could not unite Greece, and Sparta was defeated. And Philip II, the king of Macedon, we talked about him earlier, united all of Greece, conquered all of Greece. After his death, his son Alexander, the crown prince, will expand his control over Asia, over the Persian Empire, and a huge empire, one of the largest in the world, the Macedonian Empire. And so Athens will be ruled by the Macedonians. Of course, Rome then conquers the Macedonians in 4 wars in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. Subsequently, Athens lost its political power when it was the dominant power in Greece, in the Greek world, and it became a 3rd-rate political power, never recovered. As a matter of fact, the area in which Athens is located is the area of Achaia, and Rome made Achaia a province and put the capital at Corinth. So it doesn't have really any great political power remaining, but it continued to be the intellectual leader of the entire ancient world at the time that Paul visited. Now, to look at this history, which is so fascinating, it is the world's first democracy, but it was a slow process. And the reason I want to comment on this is that aspects of that slow process are still to be found at the time that Paul was there, particularly, if you will notice the second line, the Council of the Areopagus. Now, originally, Athens was a monarchy, it had a king. But by the time that we get into a historical period in the 7th century, we don't know much more about Athens for the 7th century. At that time, the king was gone. And we have a council of the Areopagus ruling Athens. It was made up of ex-kings, well, the head kings, and later of nobility, because this is a time that nobility is ruling Athens. And this council of the Areopagus, the very council before which Paul will speak, this council was gradually stripped of its power under the democracy. It keeps losing power until finally it heard only cases of homicide. But in the original constitution, which we might call the archaic constitution or the monarchical constitution, but in that original system of government, the Council of the Areopagus handled legislative and judicial matters. There were archons. We've already seen that word archon. It means leader. There were archons who handled administrative functions as assistants to the kings originally, and then working with the Council of the Areopagus. There were 9 of them selected each year. And one of those archons gave his name to the year. They didn't have numbers for the years, so they would say in the year of Alexis, for instance. And then there were polemarchs. Polemarchs were generals. So you have the Council of the Areopagus handling legislative and judicial matters. You have the archons handling administrative matters, and the polemarchs handling the military matters. The importance of this early constitution is you needed birth. You needed to be a noble. Also wealth, but particularly birth. Now, notice the last line. There was also an assembly. The word for assembly is ekklesia. It is the Greek word from which the word church is translated. It means the called out. It is an assembly. So there was an assembly for all citizens. Gradually over the years, that assembly will gain more and more powers. The second constitution of Athens came in 594. This gentleman you see on the right, Solon. The reason for that is the growth of business and the growth of a middle class. Athens was producing a pottery and commanding the pottery market throughout the world, beautiful vases and such like. They also sold olive oil. And so as business built up and people became wealthy but had no power in the government, they wanted power in the government, and that was just preliminary to a revolution. And many Greek cities did have a revolution, and the result was a tyrant controlling them. So Solon put out a constitution where wealthy people had the power. Now, the people of birth, the nobility still had some power, but that power was based on whatever amount of wealth they had. And that wealth might be produce grown from their lands. So the reforms of Solon included the machinery for democracy. It was a step in that direction. The government now was handled particularly by a council of the 400, thus replacing the functions of the Council of the Areopagus, though they continued to exist. The Council of 400 was 100 people from each of the 4 classes in Athens that were constructed by the wealth of those people. There's the wealthiest, the first 100, and on down to the poorest in the last 100, but 100 from each class comprising a council, the Council of 400. He included more people in the government in this way and helped people understand how to govern themselves. That's step number 2 in the direction of a constitution and here of a democracy. And here is the final step. The democratic constitution of 508 BC. Cleisthenes was the one who put it into effect. He was an archon in that year. And so he completely redesigned the government. The effect of it was to give power to every citizen. And there was no particular power for being noble, no particular power for being wealthy. He created a new council, the Council of the 500. And he did this in an ingenious way. He made 10 different tribes, just artificially, 10 tribes from the whole population of Attica, which is the region around Athens. And he chose 50 men from each of the 10 tribes, and they were chosen not by vote, but by lot. They were just names put into a big pot, and they were drawn out of the pot. And there were 50 thus from each of the 10 tribes. They were selected in different districts of Attica called demes, which are very much like counties, perhaps. And this Council of the 500 met in a tholos, which is a beehive-shaped building in the Agora, and were fed at public expense. We'll see what the Agora looks like today. It's just the remains, the foundation. The Council of the 500 controlled finance, public works, foreign affairs, judicial matters. They introduced legislation, and they made declarations of war. And you see how power is taken away from the Council of the Areopagus. And under this democratic constitution, citizenship is what counts. Any citizen has as much power as anybody else. As a matter of fact, every citizen in Attica was likely to, at one time or maybe twice in his lifetime, serve on that Council of the 500 to have his name drawn out of that pot. Now, here's what the tholos looks like today. It's only the foundations, but you can see it was a round building and originally, as I said, shaped like a beehive. This is another picture that gives us a little more larger perspective of the tholos. Now, here's a picture of the Agora, and we're looking toward, on the left, you see the restored Stoa of Atticus to give us an idea of what the buildings in the Agora looked like, because there were stoas everywhere. Stoa is from the Greek word for porch, because these were long buildings. You'll see a better picture in a moment, with a portico in front that was open to the air. And then the back half of this building was divided up into different rooms where there were businesses or where there were offices. When the Romans came to Athens, they built it up. They remodeled it, they enhanced it, and these are some Roman statues in the Agora. Here you see some columns from temples or buildings that are now lying in ruins. You can see them all over the Agora. It's interesting to walk through there. It's just a fascinating experience. Here's another picture showing the restored Stoa of Atticus. It was some Americans who built this building, put it back, to give visitors to Athens an idea of what the original buildings looked like. And now this picture shows the foundations of government buildings. The Agora was the headquarters of the Athenian government during a time that Athens put together a powerful empire that controlled all of Greece and its area. Now let's come back to the text. And I give that background so you can have an idea of what Paul felt like, because Luke said, while Paul was waiting for them, that is for Silas and Timothy, at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. So imagine Paul, the ex-Pharisee, Paul, who was brought up strictly a Jew and still, of course, adhered to the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thyself any graven image. And so he comes into the Agora and he sees all of these graven images, all of these idols. You can understand why his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. So he reasoned. He reasoned in the synagogues, and he reasoned in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Anybody, everybody. And there were a lot of people, and he was just wandering around reasoning with people. Like Isaiah said, come, let us reason together. This is God speaking to his people. Your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as wool. And Paul was reasoning with people who had never heard of the one true God. And then the philosophers, some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. He was reasoning with them. And some of them said he's a babbler. And they actually used the word seed picker. He's like a bird who picks up a seed one place and drops it over here and picks up another seed. In other words, he's just playing with ideas. I imagine someone who was not acquainted with these philosophies, some of the people who were standing there wondering, what is this? What's going on here? But others said, maybe he's a preacher of foreign divinities. He's preaching Jesus and the resurrection. So they brought him to the Areopagus to find out what this new teaching was. Now, understand, they are not hostile. They're not arresting him. They're not putting him on trial before the council. They are interested and concerned. You bring some strange things to our ears. We want to know. What do these things mean? And Luke adds, the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So they were pleased, they were delighted to have Paul come and share his views with them. Now, just notice before we leave verse 21, the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there. If you remember what I just said about the democracy, which is somewhat still in existence at the time of Paul, citizenship is important. So Athenians refers to people who are Athenian citizens. The foreigners who lived there had no political power, but there were many foreigners, and they distinguished between an Athenian and anybody who's not an Athenian. Often they were called metics because these are people who came there on business, but they were not citizens. So both Athenians and the foreigners were interested in hearing and telling something new. Now, you're familiar with Socrates. I just wanted you to understand a little bit about the Stoics and the Epicureans, so we'll back up a little bit. There were philosophers all the way back into the 7th century. Those are the pre-Socratics. There were a line of philosophers that believed that reality was in the realm of the spiritual, and there were those who believed that reality was in the realm of physical. Socrates is perhaps more of a spiritual person. He even challenged the Athenian democracy because everybody had equal power, and he considered that this government just resulted in chaos. And he believed in wisdom. He was therefore unpopular with a lot of the crowd and the mobs in the Agora, but yet he would still hang around the Agora and the gymnasia where the athletes were working out and engaging anybody who would talk with him, very much like Paul was doing. He had some interesting pupils, some of them rather notorious. Plato, you will notice, is among his pupils. He's called the active apostle of individualism, thinking for yourself. He accused the democracy of just kind of mob rule, the idea that there will be some general idea at the time that will prevail, and it may not be reasonable at all. He always spoke of his genius because he had this, as you see, an intense inner life. The genius, is it a conscience or is it something like the Holy Spirit? What Socrates said is that this genius spoke to him, but only when he was about to do something wrong and stopped him. So you see how he is a very spiritual person. Now, he never left Athens except to fight in the war, in the Peloponnesian War. He fought at the Battle of Delium and fought bravely. Other than that, he never left Athens. He was born in 469, he died in 399. The Delphic oracle once said, "There's no one in the world wiser than Socrates." And Socrates said, "I know I don't have any wisdom." He was always just searching for wisdom. And if I'm the wisest, then there's nobody wiser than me, then there's no wisdom anywhere. So we'll search for it. Plato was one of his pupils, searching for wisdom. Born in 427, died in 347. And Plato left Athens after Socrates was put to death. The democracy finally put him to death. And it so discouraged Plato that he left the city, but he came back in 388 and founded his school there, the academy, the Platonic Academy, that lasted for 1,000 years. He taught there for the next 40 years, receiving no money for his teaching. Plato's idea is that reality is not visible. It is spiritual. It is in the realm of forms. To explain a form, we think of, for instance, chair. A physical chair can be destroyed. Think of house. A physical house can burn down, or it can be remodeled, can be torn down. It can change. Think of the human body. It can grow and does grow old, and it dies. And Plato said that can't be real. Reminds us of what Paul said when he said the things that are not seen are eternal, and things that are seen are temporal. And so Plato said what is real is the idea of a chair, the idea of a house, the idea of a human being. That doesn't change. That's there in your mind. And that comes from God. Everything begins with God, And all of reality comes from God. Very strong belief in God, though not a God that is compatible with what the Bible reveals of God. Now, Aristotle was Plato's pupil for 20 years. Aristotle founded his own school at Athens called the Lyceum. Aristotle took a completely different approach to reality. He assumed the reality of material things, of matter. And his reasoning started with material things and looked at the similarities of material things and formed general concepts and worked his way up to God. That's what we call inductive reasoning. Whereas Plato starts with God and comes down to the material things, that's deductive reasoning. And Aristotle said everything is in a state of becoming, a process, and it's reaching toward its potential. Everything has a potential and is becoming that potential. Now here's a painting, very famous painting by the Renaissance painter Raphael. You see Plato on the left. He has his finger pointing up to God and the universals or the forms. And on the right, you see his pupil Aristotle with his palm out, pointing downward, directing attention to the particulars or to material things. Interesting how Christians have at times been influenced by Plato and by Aristotle. Now, the situation is very different under Alexander and subsequently, because once Athens was defeated and Sparta was defeated, the individual independent city-state in Greece, the polis, was gone. Now, everybody was a part of a big overarching empire, a cosmopolitan situation. So in that situation, philosophy is concerned with the individual, because philosophy up to this point had been concerned with your relationship to the state, now with the individual. And the pursuit of pleasure in a cosmopolitan world. How do you find meaning? How do you find pleasure in this vast cosmopolitan world, this vast world that is inclusive of so many different people? As the Hellenistic Empire included many different countries, and the Roman Empire many more, and cultures. Now, the two leading Hellenistic philosophers were the people who founded the schools of philosophy with whom Paul dialogued and reasoned, Zeno and Epicurus. You see their pictures here. Zeno was the founder of Stoicism. Stoicism means the porch, because his pupils met on the stoa, on the porch. It is a philosophy with religious overtones. It is Hellenistic, of course. It stressed personal pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Now, obviously, if you're going to try to find pleasure, you want to avoid pain. So how do you avoid pain? To Zeno, he says, submit to your duty, to fate. Do your duty. Do what you're supposed to do. The reason he talked about fate is that this philosophy is fatalistic, which means everything's determined ahead of time. It's just going to happen. Now, oftentimes, Reformed people are accused of being fatalistic. The philosophy of que sera, sera, what will be, will be. There's a big difference between fatalism and the gospel. Fatalism has no sense of a God who has a purpose, who has rules with justice and power. It is true Zeno believed in God. I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. But the God of the Stoics is not the God of Christianity, because we do, as Reformed people, believe in predestination, in election, but it is the purpose, the eternal purpose of God that he's working out. He works everything in accordance with that eternal purpose. And in this process, God's justice is satisfied because Christ endured the penalty for injustice, for the sins of his people. And we believe in a God with power who is sovereign. The Stoics do not believe in such a God. And matter of fact, to the Stoics, God himself is bound by fate. Whatever just is going to happen, nobody set it in order, it's just going to happen. And even God is controlled by that. Now here is one of this is the porch, of course, of the restored Stoa of Attalus, but you see what it looks like. A long corridor with columns open to the air on one side. To the left are the various offices or stores, businesses, whatever. And these buildings were all over the Agora. The emphasis, remember, is on doing one's duty in Stoicism. Very popular with the Roman soldiers because they emphasized doing your duty. So many of them were Stoics. Stoics were also, and I said I would mention about the view of God, they're pantheists. They believe that God is in everything. That's a strange view because we believe that God is the creator and above everything. To them, God was the spirit of reason. And to them, matter was inseparable from God. So you see, their God is not the God of the scriptures. The result is that Stoics cultivated apathy and lack of concern, because if things are just going to happen and you have no control over it, and you need to go with the flow and find out where your duty lies, then of course you don't do it with passion, you don't do it with concern, you just go with it. Now Epicureanism also is concerned with pleasure. It was founded by Epicurus. The belief of Epicurus was that the universe is constructed from atoms. And we say, well, that's true. He believed in the atomic theory, that these atoms descend and everything is formed and shaped from these atoms, not only physically, but spiritually as well. And when they come to man, the atoms make a swerve, and that swerve gives man his free will. So Epicureans were free will people, and Stoics were determinist people. Now that meant that human affairs are always just a matter of chance, just a matter of what people make up their minds to do. There's no order here. And so you avoid pain under the Epicurean system by withdrawing from any situation that you can identify would cause you pain. Now, what causes the most pain? Religion. Religion instills fear, said Epicurus. And so if you want to avoid the fear of religion, just be atheistic. And the greatest good is pleasure, the absence of pain, so you avoid anything causing pain. They had a very materialistic view of the soul. And so there's the background. Here comes Paul into the Agora. He is provoked. He reasoned in the synagogue, and he reasoned in the Agora, obviously with anybody who's in there, but also with these Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. And we saw there were two opinions about Paul. He's a seed picker. He's just playing with different ideas, throwing ideas out there. And others said, no, no, no. He is bringing to us new divinities, and that interests us. So he is brought to the Areopagus. Now, we'll look at the great sermon in the Areopagus. Very important sermon. I wanted to spend a complete lesson on that. But before we leave today, these comments from the scholar Matthew Henry, the Reformed scholar Matthew Henry, I think they are valuable. Jesus, they took for a new God, and anastasis, the resurrection, for a new goddess. Thus, they lost the benefit of the Christian doctrine by dressing it up in a pagan dialect, as if believing in Jesus and looking for the resurrection were the worshiping of new demons or divinities. They desired to know more of it, only because it was new and strange. May we know what this new doctrine is. This was a fair proposal, said Henry. It was fit that they should know what this doctrine was before they embraced it. And they were so fair as not to condemn it until they had some account of it. And to that we will turn next week. But before, notice this question. What does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? That is a question put forth by the early Christian thinker Tertullian, 2nd century. And you can see from the tenor of that question, he did not think much of the philosophy of Athens. So let's look at some questions. These are not questions that you can make a yes or no answer to. It's just thought questions that I would like you to think about, and particularly between now and our next study, when we look at the sermon in the Areopagus. Is Christianity a philosophy? Of course, we have to define what philosophy is. Does philosophy shape one's worldview? Do you look at the world through the lens of your philosophy? Are our actions the result of our philosophy, of our worldview? Are Christianity and philosophy opposed to each other, as Tertullian believed from that question above? However, people like St. Augustine did not believe that was the case, because he thought Plato was closest to the truth, and there was much we could learn from Plato. Is he correct? I should mention that St. Thomas Aquinas used Aristotle to great advantage in constructing his systematic theology. Why did Paul go to the Agora? He's by himself, at the time. Why did he go? Why did he go then with them to the Areopagus? When you say to preach the gospel, we'll see what he said next week as he addresses an audience of educated philosophers. Remember, this council once ruled Athens. We'll see what he has to say. But why did he have a negative view of philosophy when he wrote to the Colossians and he wrote to the Corinthians? And finally, think about this. Is there danger in thinking and answering philosophically rather than biblically? So I'll leave you those questions to think about. And we'll have time next week to look more in depth at this great sermon, the only time that we're going to see a complete sermon given by Luke of Paul addressing an audience that is entirely pagan and that is made up largely of philosophers and also of the old Athenian nobility who comprise the Council of the Areopagus. Thank you for joining us today in our study. May God's blessings be with you in the week ahead. And we will return to the last part, Lord willing, next week.